Okay, so
Hmm.
leading teams when everyone's remote
Yeah,
and you want to know how to stay close with your team even when you're not physically there.
right.
Seems tough, right?
Uh,
Well, you sent us some cool stuff on this.
yeah.
A piece from The Conversation
Okay.
and an academic article from the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology.
Sounds good.
Let's dive in.
Definitely. This is something so many people are thinking about these days,
Right.
especially with remote work becoming more common.
Yeah.
This research is all about the psychology behind it.
Oh, interesting.
It looks at this idea of psychological distance.
Okay. I get feeling physically distant when you're working remotely,
Right.
but what is psychological distance exactly?
It's basically how close or distant you feel from your manager, no matter where you're actually located.
Okay.
Like you could be in the same building as your boss,
Right.
but still feel super disconnected if you don't communicate well or don't feel appreciated.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's all about feeling connected, even if you're not in the same room.
So it's more than just being physically together.
Exactly. And the study breaks this down into 4 parts. They call them dimensions.
Okay.
Spatial, temporal, social, and then there's this one called hypotheticality.
4 dimensions. That sounds a little complicated.
I can explain.
Yeah.
So spatial is the simplest one.
Oh.
It's just the physical distance between you and your boss.
Gotcha.
Temporal is more about a feeling of connection over time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you working on similar schedules?
Okay.
Are you responding to each other quickly?
Made sense.
Are you in sync?
So it's about being on the same page time-wise.
Exactly.
What about social and hypotheticality?
Social distance is that feeling of belonging,
Right.
like you're part of a team.
Okay.
Even when you're not physically together,
Yeah,
you build that through interacting regularly, whether it's virtual or in person.
I get it. And hypotheticality. That one sounds a bit more abstract.
It is a little more complex. It's about how real or tangible something feels.
Okay.
In a remote setting, it could be like,
Yeah.
do your manager's goals feel achievable,
Right.
or do they seem totally out of reach?
So if your boss is setting crazy goals
Yeah,
or their communication is confusing,
right.
that could make you feel more distant
Exactly.
even if you talk to them all the time.
And all 4 of these dimensions,
Mhm.
spatial, temporal, social, and hypotheticality, they can all affect how we experience remote work.
That's really interesting. So how does leadership fit into all of this?
The researchers wanted to see how different leadership styles affected that feeling of psychological distance.
Okay.
They looked at 3 main styles: initiating structure, consideration, and vision communication.
I know about those leadership styles, but can you remind our listener what they actually look like?
Sure. Initiating structure is about tasks.
Okay.
It's setting clear expectations, giving structure, making sure everyone knows what they need to do and when. Consideration is more about relationships,
Right.
showing genuine care and supporting your team.
So it's less about directing and more about connecting.
Exactly. And then we have vision communication.
Okay.
This is about inspiring your team with a long-term vision,
Interesting.
helping them see the big picture and how their work fits into it.
So did they find that certain styles were better at reducing psychological distance?
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
The study found that initiating structure,
Mhm.
that task-focused style,
Right.
didn't actually reduce psychological distance.
Oh, that's surprising.
You'd think that clear expectations would help people feel more connected,
Yeah.
but it didn't really work that way.
So are you saying that being organized and setting clear goals isn't important for remote leaders?
Not at all. It's still super important to be organized and have clear goals,
Okay.
but in a remote setting,
Yeah.
it's just not enough to focus only on tasks and structure.
Gotcha. So what about consideration and vision communication?
Those were way more effective at reducing psychological distance.
Really?
It turns out that showing you care and sharing an inspiring vision of the future
Yeah.
can really bring people closer to their leader, even when they're miles apart.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Why do you think those styles were so impactful in a remote setting?
Well, the researchers connect this to something called conservation of resources theory, or COR theory for short.
Okay.
It basically says that people get stressed when they feel like their valuable resources are threatened.
Interesting. What kind of resources?
Things like social support,
Right.
a sense of control, even just feeling like you belong.
So in a remote setting
Yeah,
where people might already be feeling isolated,
exactly.
those resources can feel even more fragile.
That's where leadership comes in.
Okay.
When leaders show consideration and communicate a strong vision,
Yeah.
it's like they're saying, hey, even though we're not together. I'm here for you.
So it's about reassurance, making
Mm-hmm.
people feel safe and supported, even when they're working remotely.
And that sense of security can affect how employees deal with the challenges of remote work.
How so?
The study looked at 3 ways people cope: task coping, emotion coping, and avoidance coping,
Okay.
and how they're linked to psychological distance.
Interesting. Maybe if you talk about those in the next part. Sounds like a plan.
So we were talking about how different leadership styles can affect how close or distant you feel from your manager when you're working remotely.
Right, and how that feeling then impacts how you deal with the stress and challenges of working remotely.
Exactly, those coping mechanisms.
You mentioned 3 ways of coping:
Yeah.
task coping, emotion coping, and avoidance coping.
Mm.
Can you break those down a little more?
Sure. So task coping, that's like being a problem solver.
Okay,
It's about tackling challenges head on,
got it.
coming up with solutions,
Right.
staying focused on getting things done.
So if something gets in your way at work,
Yeah,
task coping is like figuring out how to get over it.
exactly. Then you have emotion coping.
Okay.
This one can be good or bad depending on how you use it.
How so?
Like positive emotion coping might be trying to see a stressful situation in a better light
Okay.
or reaching out for support.
Right.
But negative emotion coping, that would be like blaming yourself,
Mm-hmm.
dwelling on negative stuff,
Okay.
or getting stuck worrying all the time.
So it's all about how you handle your emotions when things get tough.
Exactly. And then there's avoidance coping.
I think I know this one.
You probably do.
Yeah.
It's basically distracting yourself from work stress, putting things off.
Procrastinating.
Yeah. Maybe even zoning out with Netflix or scrolling through social media.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Definitely. But the question is,
Yeah.
how do these coping styles connect to that feeling of distance from your manager?
Right. Does feeling closer to or further from your boss change how you handle stress?
That's the big question. And the findings were pretty interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
So remember how we talked about consideration being super important for closeness?
Yeah, that was the style where leaders show they care and support their team.
Exactly. And the research found that employees who felt closer to their leaders because of those consideration behaviors
Right.
were way more likely to use task coping,
Interesting.
that problem-solving approach.
So feeling supported by your manager actually helps you tackle challenges better.
It's like having a safety net.
Yeah. You know someone has your back.
Exactly. And that gives you confidence to try new things.
You're not so afraid of failing.
Right. Because you know you have support if things don't go perfectly.
Makes sense, but what about avoidance coping?
Yeah.
It seems strange that feeling closer to your boss could make you want to avoid work.
It does seem counterintuitive.
Right.
But that's what they found in the first study.
The one done during the pandemic lockdown.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
Employees who felt closer to their leader were more likely to use avoidance coping.
So even though that feeling of support helps with problem solving,
Yeah.
it could also lead to more procrastination.
It's a bit of a puzzle, to be honest.
Yeah, why would that be?
And it's important to remember this was just one study.
Right.
But the researchers thought maybe it had something to do with wanting a sense of normalcy
Okay.
during a really stressful time.
That makes sense.
Remember, this was early in the pandemic
Wow.
when everything felt super chaotic.
People were anxious and looking for ways to cope.
Exactly. And for some people, that might have meant turning to their manager
Right.
for a little break from the stress.
So it's like saying, work can wait for a bit. I need a breather.
Exactly. And because I feel connected to my manager, I feel okay taking a step back.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
It shows how complex all of this is,
Yeah, the relationship between work and stress and our connections with others.
especially when you're working remotely.
Now, what about emotion coping?
They found that feeling close to your leader was linked to less of that negative self-blame coping.
So you're less likely to beat yourself up when things go wrong.
Right. You have that support system.
It's like having someone to help you see things in perspective.
You're not alone in facing challenges.
When you feel connected to your manager,
Yeah.
you don't see setbacks as personal failures.
Right. You see them as chances to learn and grow.
And you know you have help to get through those tough times.
Exactly. It all comes back to that feeling of safety and support.
This is so insightful.
It really highlights how important the human side of leadership is.
especially when we're working remotely.
It's not just about assigning tasks and checking progress.
Right.
It's about creating a culture where people feel trusted and supported.
Yeah, where they can be themselves, even if work is happening at their kitchen table.
Exactly. And remember, leadership is an ongoing thing.
It's not a one-time thing.
Right. You have to keep showing up for your team,
Okay.
being present and engaged, creating an environment where everyone feels valued and heard.
And empowered to do their best work.
Absolutely.
This has given me and hopefully our listeners a lot to think about.
And there's still more. In the next part, we'll take everything we've learned
Uh-huh.
and turn it into advice you can actually use in your own remote or hybrid work life.
Sounds good. All right, so we've talked about all this fascinating stuff about psychological distance and leading remotely.
Yeah.
Now let's get practical.
Okay.
How can we actually use these insights?
Good question.
Uh-huh.
So first, I think it's helpful to just think about your own coping mechanisms
Okay.
when you're stressed at work,
Yeah.
especially when working remotely. What do? Are your strategies helping you stay focused and productive?
Right. Or are you just avoiding things and procrastinating more?
Exactly. Once you understand your own coping style a little better,
Yeah.
you can think about how that feeling of distance from your manager might be playing a role. Do you feel connected to your manager and team? Or are there times when you feel kind of separated?
Interesting. And what if you are feeling that distance? What can you do about it?
If you're a leader, remember that consideration thing we talked about?
Showing you care and supporting your team?
Exactly. Make a point of checking in with your team members regularly.
Right.
Not just about work, but how they're doing personally.
Right.
Celebrate their wins, offer support when they're struggling.
Makes sense.
Even try to create some fun, casual interactions like a virtual coffee break or something.
That's a good idea, even if it's just online.
Those little things can really help people feel connected.
What about vision communication?
Oh, yeah, that's crucial too.
Especially when you're not seeing people face to face.
Right, you don't get those in-person cues.
How can leaders make sure their vision is actually resonating with their remote team?
It's all about clear communication.
Like,
Don't just talk about your vision once and expect everyone to remember.
Gotcha.
You have to keep reinforcing it. Make it relevant to their daily work.
Right.
Help them see how they're contributing to the bigger picture.
It's like showing them how their individual pieces fit into the whole puzzle.
Exactly. You can use stories, examples, data to bring your vision to life.
And don't forget about feedback.
Absolutely. Make sure your team feels heard,
Yeah.
that their opinions matter.
This is great advice for leaders, but what if you're not a manager?
You don't have to be a manager to be a leader.
True.
Take the initiative to reach out to your colleagues,
Okay.
schedule virtual coffee chats, participate in team activities.
So it's about taking charge of your own connections.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to talk about your challenges.
Yeah.
Ask for help when you need it,
Being vulnerable can actually build trust.
especially when you're working remotely and it's easy to feel isolated.
I bet clear communication is important for everyone, not just leaders.
100%. Be proactive about communicating your progress.
Okay.
Let people know if you hit any roadblocks. Be clear about when you're available.
The more open you are, the better your team can support you.
Exactly.
All of this is really helpful. It seems like the key is to be intentional
Yes.
about building those connections, whether you're the boss or not.
Remote work has its challenges,
For sure.
but it also gives us a chance to change how we connect and work together.
That's a good point.
By understanding this psychological distance thing
Right.
and using leadership styles that build closeness and trust,
Yeah.
we can create really amazing remote teams.
This has been a super insightful deep dive into leading remotely.
Thanks for having me.
I hope our listeners now have a better grasp of all the psychology involved
Yeah.
and that they feel empowered to actually make their remote work experience better.
Remember, leadership isn't about your job title.
It's about so much more.
It's how you show up for your team, how you inspire them, how you create an environment where everyone feels valued and supported.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep connecting, and keep diving deep, because even in a digital world, human connection is what really matters.